Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going way back to the Civil War era. We're going to try to unravel this really fascinating story of Mary Surratt.
Oh, yeah, this will be good.
You sent over some excerpts from the American History Tellers podcast episode, The Widow and the Assassin. And
That's a good one.
yeah, it looks like we'll be looking into her connection to John Wilkes Booth and, of course, the Lincoln assassination.
You know, it's really amazing to me how some historical events can still have so many unanswered questions, even when, like, you think what went down.
Right.
It seems like this deep dive is going to be right up the alley of anyone who likes a good historical mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Or, maybe even true crime, where the lines between guilt and innocence, well, they aren't always so clear.
I'm already hooked. Let's get started by kind of setting the stage. Back in Civil War era Maryland,
Yeah.
you've really got to imagine this border state just full of divided loyalties, right smack in the middle of the conflict.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's where we first meet Mary Surratt. On the surface, just an ordinary tavern owner. But then her life gets totally intertwined with some of the most significant events in American history.
Yeah, and Maryland's location really just makes this story so much more complex.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just sandwiched right between the North and South Maryland, and the people living there were just totally split.
Oh.
Some families even had members fighting on opposite sides of the war.
Oh, wow.
And that's really important for understanding Mary Surratt's story, because her tavern, which was in Surrattsville, became this hub for Confederate activity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a meeting place for spies and smugglers and anyone who was sympathetic to the South.
So, her tavern was a hotbed of, secret operations right in the middle of this divided state.
Yeah, pretty much.
It makes you wonder what they were talking about behind closed doors.
For sure.
What was the atmosphere like in a place like that?
Oh, I bet it was tense and definitely secretive,
Yeah.
because it was wartime and information was gold.
Right.
Spies would have been gathering intelligence, smuggling routes were probably discussed, and maybe even plots were hatched there.
Now, one really key player in all of this is John Wilkes Booth. He was a big-time actor at the time.
But yeah, he was famous.
And he was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer.
Absolutely.
And the podcast episode that you shared, it mentioned that Booth's initial plan was actually to kidnap President Lincoln.
Right.
So how did that plan turn into something so much darker?
Well, you got to imagine, Booth, this guy who was used to being in the spotlight. He was facing the defeat of everything he believed in.
Right.
And as the Confederacy fell apart, he just got more and more desperate.
Wow.
He saw Lincoln as the symbol of the Union, and he thought if Lincoln was dead, maybe the South could still win, or at least it would throw the country into chaos. And that's when the plan shifted from kidnapping to assassination.
It's kind of scary how personal beliefs and desperation can make someone do something so awful.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is that Mary Surratt ends up moving to Washington, D.C., and she opens this boarding house.
Right.
And guess who starts coming around? John Wilkes Booth.
Oh, yeah, he was a regular there.
But there's another person we got to talk about, Louis Weichmann.
Right.
He was a boarder there who started noticing some shady stuff happening. So what was it about the boarding house that caught his attention?
Weichmann's observations are really key to understanding everything that led up to the assassination.
Mm-hmm.
He starts to see this pattern of secretive behavior. Quiet conversations, meetings late at night, tons of suspicious characters coming and going.
Mm-hmm.
He knew something was up, something dangerous, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was.
So he was right there watching history unfold, but didn't realize how big it was going to be.
Exactly.
And then we've got those trips that Mary Surratt made back to her old tavern in Surrattsville, just days before Lincoln was killed.
Right.
And there's that incident where she tells her tenant, John Lloyd, to get the shooting irons ready.
Oh, yeah, that's super suspicious, especially with the timing. I mean, her going back to the tavern and asking for shooting irons puts her right in the middle of this whole conspiracy.
Right.
Whether she meant to be or not. And even though historians still debate how much she actually knew about Booth's plan to kill Lincoln, her actions right before it happened are definitely suspicious.
It really makes you think, what was she thinking? Did she get how serious this was, or was she being tricked by Booth?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was she in on it? Or was she, like her defense later said, an unwitting pawn in something much bigger and much more sinister?
And then, well, then the worst possible thing happens.
Yeah.
Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Things must have been pure chaos after that.
Absolutely. Total chaos. The nation was in shock and mourning. I mean, Lincoln, the guy who had led them through the Civil War, was gone, just like that. And the hunt for Booth was relentless. Anyone who even knew him was a suspect.
And because of our connection to Booth and those trips to the tavern, Mary Surratt was right in the crosshairs.
Right in the middle of it.
So what happened next?
Well,
So they arrest her and put her on trial. But this wasn't just any trial, right? It was a military tribunal.
Yep.
Which, now that I think about it, that must have been a pretty big deal back then.
Oh, you're right to bring that up. Military tribunals, they've always been controversial. They often kind of they bypass the usual legal stuff. And in Mary Surratt's case, her lawyers, they actually argued that she should have been tried in a civilian court.
I see.
Yeah, they felt that, especially with everyone still so upset after Lincoln's assassination, that a military tribunal wouldn't give her a fair trial.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what was the evidence against her that made them decide to try her in a military court? What were the biggest things the prosecution had against her?
Well, the prosecution, they really relied a lot on circumstantial evidence and what witnesses said. They were trying to tie Mary Surratt directly to the plot. And one of the most damaging things they had was what John Lloyd said. He was the guy who rented her tavern, remember?
Right.
And he testified that she went to the tavern just a couple of days before Lincoln was killed, and that she told him to have shooting irons ready for someone to pick up.
Whoa, that sounds pretty bad. How did the prosecution use that to build their case against her?
They argued that by asking for shooting irons, Mary was showing she knew about Booth's plan and that she was part of it. They painted this picture of her as an active participant, someone who was helping to arm the conspirators.
Right.
And they also brought up that package that Booth had given to Mary to hold on to.
Yeah, what was in that?
Turned out to be binoculars,
Yeah.
which Booth was planning to use when he made his getaway.
Oh, so they were trying to show that she was directly helping Booth, like multiple times?
Exactly. They said that she wasn't just, kind of aware of what was happening. She was actively helping Booth get ready. And they leaned hard on Louis Weichmann's testimony, too. Remember him?
Yeah, the border.
Yeah. Even though he couldn't directly say she was part of the assassination plot, what he said about all the shady stuff going on at her boarding house, all the weird people hanging around, it made people really suspicious of Mary and her connection to Booth.
Right. So the prosecution was trying to say that she was at the center of this whole Confederate network. What about her defense? What did they do to fight back against that?
Mary Surratt's lawyers, they focused on showing her as this, this devout Catholic, a loving mother, and a victim of circumstance. They said she had absolutely no idea what Booth was really planning. And all those things, like the whole shooting irons thing, were just innocent misunderstandings, blown way out of proportion. They insisted that she was just doing a favor for a friend, and that she had no clue those shooting irons were for anything other than, hunting.
So they were saying she wasn't involved in any of that political stuff or violence.
Exactly. They were trying to show her as someone who was being used by John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
That her actions were being twisted to look bad. They also tried to discredit John Lloyd and Louis Weichmann's testimonies.
How so?
Well, they pointed out some things in Lloyd's story that didn't add up. They suggested that maybe he was trying to save himself by blaming Mary. And they said that Weichmann, although he was a good guy, maybe he misinterpreted what he saw, or maybe Booth tricked him on purpose.
I see.
They reminded everyone that Weichmann was good friends with Mary's son, John Surratt Jr., and that maybe that made him see things in a way that was more favorable to Mary.
So both sides had very different stories. It sounds like a he said, she said kind of thing, where the same events get interpreted in completely different ways.
That's a good way to put it. And it's really important to think about what was happening in the country back then. Everyone was still reeling from Lincoln being killed. There's this huge need for justice, maybe even revenge. And with all that emotion swirling around, it must have been really hard for the jury to stay objective and fair.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that her being a woman back then played a role in how people saw her and judged her? I mean, would a man in the same situation have been seen as suspiciously?
That's a good question. I mean, the roles of men and women and what society expected of them were so different back then. Mary Surratt, she was a middle-aged widow, a mother. She didn't fit the typical image of someone who would be part of a conspiracy or be, a political radical.
Right.
Some historians actually say that this difference, this clash between what people expected of a woman and what she was being accused of, that might have actually contributed to her being found guilty.
It's sad to think that maybe she was judged more harshly just because she was a woman who didn't fit the mold. And of course, in the end, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. How did people react to that?
Oh, it was a huge shock to the nation. A lot of people were stunned, especially since she was the first woman to be executed by the U.S. government.
Wow.
There were even people on the military tribunal who, even though they voted to convict her, they still thought the sentence was too harsh.
Hmm.
They actually asked President Andrew Johnson to change her sentence to life in prison.
Oh, wow.
They argued that hanging a woman, especially one who was considered old for the time, was just too much, and it would set a dangerous precedent.
So even some of the people who thought she was guilty still had a problem with how severe the punishment was. What did President Johnson do?
Well, unfortunately, President Johnson, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated, he refused to give her clemency. He was under a lot of pressure to bring justice and to show that the government wouldn't tolerate any kind of treason, especially after such a horrible national tragedy.
So, even with people pleading for mercy and saying the punishment didn't fit the crime, Mary Surratt was hanged, along with three of the men who conspired with Booth,
Right.
on July 7th, 1865.
It was a terrible end to a life that got caught up in one of the most chaotic times in American history.
It really makes you think about how historical events have this lasting impact, how they affect people even so long after they've happened, and how they change the way we look at the past.
Absolutely.
You know, it's amazing, even after all these years, her story still gets people so riled up.
Yeah, it does.
I think her case really shows how history isn't just dates and names. It's about real people making choices and, well, crazy situations,
That's
like
awesome.
human drama playing out, and the consequences were huge.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is how people's image of her has changed over time. Like right after Lincoln was killed, she was this villain in the newspapers, right? A Confederate fanatic, a traitor. But as time went on and the Civil War, started to fade into the past, a different story started to come out.
Yeah, you're right. It's like she went from being a villain to this tragic figure, even a martyr for some.
Exactly. For some, she became a symbol of the South's resistance, this woman who was just caught in the middle of a divided nation. But others, they see her as a symbol of injustice, a woman who is wrongly accused and punished for something she didn't do. It really shows how history can be, like, rewritten depending on who's telling this story and when.
Her story also makes you think about the role women had during wartime. I mean, could a woman really have been behind something like that back then? Or was she, like her lawyers said, just swept up in events she didn't understand?
It's a question people are still arguing about. Her case makes us look at how limited women's lives were back then and how what society expected from them might have influenced how she was seen and judged.
It reminds us that history isn't always clear-cut, you know? It's full of gray areas and unanswered questions. So what do you think? What makes Mary Surratt's story so interesting even after all this time?
Well, I think her story makes us really look at the evidence,
Mm.
to weigh different sides and decide for ourselves what we think about her role in the whole thing. It also makes us face some uncomfortable truths about our own history and how justice works, especially during a crisis.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not just a historical mystery. It's a story that makes us think about human behavior, why people do what they do, and how powerful different perspectives can be.
It really shows how important it is to look at things from multiple angles and to understand the historical context. It reminds us that history isn't fixed. It's always changing as we find out new things, as social attitudes evolve, and as we each interpret things in our own way.
So, where do you stand? Do you think Mary Surratt was a hardcore Confederate, a pawn in a deadly game, or somewhere in between? We've only scratched the surface today, and there's a ton of books, articles, even other podcasts out there that go deeper into this captivating story.
I think that's the beauty of history. It's an ongoing conversation. It's like a puzzle we're still trying to put together. But what we can say for sure is that Mary Surratt's story, just like so many others from that crazy time, reminds us that the past isn't really over. It still affects us today and shapes how we see the world around us.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.